everyone. Well, I am curious. I'll bet several of you have seen this movie before. I confess it's the one of the three, and I love all three of the movies in this series, but it's the one I enjoy watching the most with people. Who amongst you has not seen this film yet in a theater with other people, just on television? Because I'm guessing a lot of you have seen it before. Okay, so several of you have seen it in the theater. Well, I'm glad you've come back for more. And let us begin today's talk with a favorite pastime of mine, which is to say a little bit of time travel. The year is no longer 2023, but 1953. And we're traveling 123 miles or so northwest to a soundstage at Paramount Pictures. And it is not just any soundstage. It is one that will help make Hollywood history. You are now standing in the middle of what, according to many sources, is the largest single set ever built on a studio lot to this time. A recreation to a degree of an actual apartment complex, complete with courtyard in New York's Greenwich Village. Built for, yes, the upcoming Paramount feature Rear Window. The set was commissioned by the man you'll see in the middle of the frame, 53-year-old filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock. And the reason he had the power to commission such an enormous, ambitious set was because of another game-changing aspect of Rear Window. And to explain that aspect of it, let us take one more step back a little more in time for some context. Alfred Hitchcock was born in 1899 in the East End of London. By the 1930s, he was making a name for himself in Britain as that country's finest director. His biggest hits were thrillers like The Man Who Knew Too Much and The 39 Steps. And those movies were so good that they were getting noticed in Hollywood, which was not true of many British films in the 1930s. Among Hitchcock's fans was this man, producer David O. Selznick. And in 1938, Selznick put Hitchcock under contract to make films for him in America. So, the director and his wife Alma and his daughter Pat moved from London to the elegant Los Angeles neighborhood of Bel Air, and that's where Hitch and his wife Alma would spend the rest of their lives. Hitchcock had been eager to come to Hollywood for years. It had the best studios, the biggest actors, the best technology. But it wasn't long before he began chafing at the limits put on him, because when it came to creative choices, David O. Selznick, the producer, always had the final say, and Hitchcock realized he was basically a talented hired hand. It was not until the summer of 1953, several years after he left Selznick and 33 years after he first joined the film industry, that Hitchcock could fully take control of his films. And that was thanks to a landmark deal masterminded by this man on the left, his agent, Lew Wasserman. Wasserman knew that executives at Paramount were tremendous Hitchcock fans, and Wasserman used that knowledge to get the director a deal that other filmmakers could only dream of, and which many filmmakers today dream of but cannot get. So bear with me on a few details. They're not too complicated, but I think they're interesting. What exactly did Hitchcock get? Well, he would make 9 features for Paramount. And there would be no producer telling him what to do. Hitchcock would both direct and produce these 9 movies. Of those 9 films, Paramount would own 4 of them, and on those 4, Hitchcock would be paid $250,000 each. That's about $2.8 million today. So, for those 4 films, he would make in today's money about $11 million. He would also get 10% of any money made from the film after the studio recouped 2 times the cost of making it. As for the other 5 films that he would do for Paramount, the deal was even better. Hitchcock would have total ownership of those 5 movies after 8 years, so any money they made 8 years after they premiered went entirely to him. Creatively, this deal also gave Hitchcock what he had always dreamed of. He had total control over story choice, writers, casting, editing, and publicity, as long as the movie cost under $3 million. Well, at that time, the average cost of an A-level movie was about $1.5 million, so half of the $3 million ceiling that Hitchcock had. That combination of creative freedom and enormous financial incentive sparked what many critics consider Hitchcock's greatest period as a filmmaker. And the first movie he made under that deal was today's film, Rear Window. It was based on a story by a best-selling writer of mysteries and thrillers, the very elusive, rarely out in public Cornell Woolrich. The story was called It Had to Be Murder, and you'll see on the right one of the magazines that ran it. There's the title down in the bottom right. The story was about a man with a broken leg who's confined for a time to a wheelchair, and to pass the time he watches his neighbors across from him in his apartment complex, and he becomes convinced that one of them is a murderer. Well, Hitchcock had long been fascinated with telling stories that took place in a confined space. In 1944, he directed Lifeboat. It takes place entirely in a small boat carrying the survivors of a ship sunk by a German torpedo during World War II, and Hitch pulled it off. 4 years later, Hitchcock's 1948 thriller Rope, starring James Stewart, was set entirely in a Manhattan penthouse, and it took place in real time. You were watching a murder and its discovery unfold in 80 minutes with no jumps in time. But Rear Window was more ambitious than either of those films. For one thing, Hitchcock wanted to make a blockbuster hit, because this was one of the 4 films that he would own after it premiered. As for casting, he knew who he wanted to star. By 1953, James Stewart was increasingly drawn to film roles that went beyond his image of an American everyman. Stewart enjoyed playing more shaded characters with nuance, not always 100% likable, and I think there's aspects of that in this film. Hitchcock also knew who he wanted as his leading lady. That would be Grace Kelly. Kelly had just co-starred for him in the film Dial M for Murder. She was not yet the name above the title star that she was about to become, and with Rear Window, Hitchcock helped make her into that kind of star. He hired 8-time Oscar winner Edith Head to design her clothes, and he told his screenwriter, the excellent John Michael Hayes, to spend a week with Grace Kelly. Tough job, I know. He told John Michael Hayes, "She has got a lot of charm and talent, but she goes through the motions as if she is in acting school." Hitchcock told Hayes to study Kelly and incorporate her personality into the character of Lisa Fremont, a fashion model who is James Stewart's character's girlfriend. And by the way, the role of Lisa was created for the film. In the short story, There Is No Girlfriend. Well, John Michael Hayes did a brilliant job incorporating Grace Kelly's personality into his script, and watch for her entrance, because I think it's the best one she ever had in a movie. Hitchcock knew that the characters in Rear Window had to be distinctive. They had to be charismatic and funny, because his plan was for the viewer to never leave the apartment of L.B. Jeffries until the very end of the film. And one of the many remarkable things about Rear Window is that rather than make us feel claustrophobic, Hitchcock, I think, makes us really enjoy staying in this limited space with Stewart and Kelly. Not to mention, also, the wonderful Thelma Ritter, who plays the nurse. Ritter was renowned for playing sharp-tongued truth-tellers. She was an actress who could toss off comic dialogue with flair, and for me, Rear Window is the ultimate showcase for her talent. So, if Rear Window all happens in such a limited space, how did Hitchcock and his collaborators make the film so riveting? Well, they did it by making the apartments across from Jeffries feel like the entire world in a microcosm. Hitchcock called it a, quote, small universe, a real index of individual behavior. Each apartment has a little story of its own, a drama or comedy, and Hitchcock turns us all into voyeurs along with James Stewart's character. He invites us to peer through the windows of others, and ultimately he makes us feel the danger that can come with that. To create this world, Hitchcock assembled an extraordinary production team. Their first job was to help him find a real-world location to set his story in. The short story doesn't say where it takes place, but Hitchcock always believed that his films were more credible if he set them in a real and recognizable location. He loved New York City, and after looking at photos taken by his location scouts, he decided to set Rear Window in Greenwich Village. In fact, the set is modeled on an actual apartment complex at 125 Christopher Street in Greenwich Village, and on the bottom you can see a recent photo of the actual location, and you can see that the filmmakers did take some inspiration from it. The job of overseeing that space was done by this man, Oscar-winning art director Joseph McMillan Johnson. Johnson and his team spent 6 weeks constructing a giant set on Paramount's largest soundstage, Stage 18. The set was almost 5 stories high, and the courtyard was about 70 feet wide. The attention to detail was impressive. 31 separate apartments were made, and 12 of those were completely furnished. Hitchcock's brilliant cinematographer, Oscar winner Robert Burks, supervised the lighting of the set, and that lighting was also complex because we see the apartment rooms at dawn, dusk, the afternoon, at night. This was the biggest electrical job ever done at Paramount to this time, and it is said that for some shots, nearly every piece of lighting equipment at the studio was being used on the set because of all the different apartments having their own lighting. On those days, those lights were generating so much heat that the soundstage's automatic sprinklers had to be turned off, or the set would have been flooded with water, and that would not have pleased Mr. Hitchcock. Now look beyond those apartments a little, and you will see small but crucial details that were added for realism. There's a Manhattan skyline, there are chimneys with smoke coming out of them, and there is an alley leading to the street, which plays an important part in one of the film's most tense sequences. Another innovation was the way that Hitchcock communicated with his crew. He was usually on the set of the main apartment, but he needed to be able to speak privately with the actors in each of those far-off apartments, and that seemed impossible in late 1953. But fortunately, he had a smart and enthusiastic assistant director named Herbert Coleman, and we see him in the photo at left. Herbert Coleman said he would take care of it. And a day before filming started, Hitchcock walked onto the main set and saw a row of buttons. Under each button was the name of one of the actors in each of those apartments, and beside the buttons was a microphone. The sound team had put individual receivers in each apartment, and all Hitchcock had to do was push a button, and he could talk privately on his microphone to the actor, and you can see that microphone in the close-up in his right hand. In a way, all of the technical knowledge that Hitchcock had been acquiring over 33 years came together on this film. He later said that he had seldom been happier than he was when making Rear Window. "I was feeling very creative at the time," he said. "The batteries were well charged." Rear Window opened in August of 1954, and it made in short time what was then a phenomenal $10 million, which is more like $110 million today. It has had many re-releases since, and it was a terrific start to Hitchcock's new relationship with Paramount. Speaking of studios, I'll say you will see a Universal Studios logo when the film begins, and you will be convinced for a moment that I've lied about everything I've told you. Well, Paramount did release this film, but Universal owns it now, so they released the home video version. Rear Window launched a period of extraordinary creativity for the director, which would include such films as Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, and his television series, every episode of which he also owned, and which ran for 10 seasons, and I think has probably never been off the air since. Not surprisingly, Rear Window elevated Grace Kelly to the rank of global superstar, and it gave James Stewart probably the most profitable role he had since, like Hitchcock, he had enough pull to have a percentage of the profits. But putting all that money and all that technology aside, Rear Window remains an extraordinary entertainment. Hitchcock liked to say that his goal was to play the audience like an organ. Well, get ready for a masterful symphony from one of the greatest composers working in cinema. And I will have a little more to say after the film, but for now, sit back and enjoy from 1954, Rear Window. Thank you. Watching that reminded me, by the way, of a couple of things you might find of interest. The script had a fair number of racy lines for the time, 1954, and when the script was submitted to the Production Code Administration, which was the in-house Hollywood censors, Joseph Breen, who was very, very strict about such things, ordered them to take a lot of those lines out of the movie. Luckily for us, he retired by the time that Rear Window was being edited. So they ignored him, and they left those lines in, and his successor was a little more broad-minded, or a lot, actually. And Hitchcock's, it's interesting, his movies are certainly full of what some critics would call dream logic, which is to say lack of logic, but we don't care because the situations are so successfully geared towards our emotions. But there were things that Hitchcock wanted to be plausible, and the reason that L.B. Jeffries has that address on West Ninth Street is because there was a police station right around the corner in real life. So he wanted it to be plausible for those New Yorkers who would understand that the police could get there that quickly, just as they do in Rancho Mirage, of course. And a last thought, Alfred Hitchcock adored animals and he loved dogs, and he was always watching other people's films privately. He never sort of publicly owned up to how much he was monitoring all the other movies that other people were making, but he watched very closely. But one of the stipulations he had for his assistant was never to show movies in which anything happened to a dog. So he broke his own rule, but for a good reason. Well, another part of his genius was his knowledge of how to sell his movies. For example, we may not have seen that much of Miss Torso in the film outside of her torso and that one brief close-up, but she was prominently featured in the movie's publicity campaign, as you can see. She may not have been Hitchcock's preferred type of cool blonde like Grace Kelly was, but Hitch knew what would sell tickets. Her name was Georgine Darcy, by the way, and she was primarily a model who was among the longest living cast members of the film. She passed away in 2004. Now, I did spot the gentleman on the left, and I suspect many of you did, but it was our own Christine Hughes who pointed out to me that in the, I think, first party scene that the composer was having, there was an uncredited extra who was Catherine Grant, soon to become Mrs. Bing Crosby. So, good call. She didn't even need a telephoto lens to recognize that. If you're wondering who played the songwriter trying to write a hit, well, Hitchcock cast that part well. It was real-life composer Ross Bagdasarian. By 1951, 3 years before Rear Window, Bagdasarian was known for writing the hit Rosemary Clooney song Come On to My House. But he would find his greatest fame 4 years after this movie, because in 1958 he created, anyone? The Chipmunks, very good. By then he was using the name David Seville, and yes, he's the one you hear talking with the Chipmunks. He did their voices, speaking very slowly, speeding them up, and he wrote their songs. So, but I would love to hear any thoughts you have, and certainly any questions you have. Last thought is that if you would like to contact me about this or anything else, you can reach me through my website or through the library. And again, before we start, I just want to thank Christine and Abe again for sponsoring the series and our wonderful hosts here at the library team. But perhaps we could bring the house lights up, and there may or may not be a roaming microphone, and if there isn't, I'll just repeat the questions back. Yes, sir. Very good point. Yes, there was no score per se. It was all what they call source music, which is the music the characters are hearing. Hitchcock hired one of the top composers in Hollywood, Franz Waxman, to write the main title. And Waxman had just won Oscars for Sunset Boulevard, then A Place in the Sun. And Hitchcock had an ulterior commercial motive in creating that part with John Michael Hayes of the songwriter. He thought that as one of the interesting sub-stories of the movie, it would be fun if you watched a composer write what proves to be a hit song. And then that song in real life would be released as sheet music and a record so that people who went to Rear Window would recognize it and buy it. Well, I think that Franz Waxman, who composed that tune, did a very nice job, but no one can guarantee something or make something into a popular hit, and it didn't. That theme did not become the popular hit Hitchcock wanted, which got him very upset. But 2 years later, he struck gold, because at that studio he made The Man Who Knew Too Much, and cast Doris Day as a former singer, and hired the Oscar-winning team of Livingston and Evans, whose song Mona Lisa, you might have heard of some of that source music. He hired them to write 2 songs for Doris Day, for The Man Who Knew Too Much. One of them was called Whatever Will Be, parens, Que Sera, Sera, and that won the Oscar for Best Song. Made a lot of money and made Hitchcock very, very happy. So, but yes, very good point. And I love the sound design on this film. As much as you can show this film as an example of great cinematography, I think you could also show it as a great example of sound design. I love that sequence on the rain, the night of the rain, where it's just sort of quiet and you hear the sounds coming out of the rain. Very dreamlike quality. The filmmaker David Lynch, who makes very strange, surreal movies, this is one of his favorite films. And when he made the movie Blue Velvet, which is partly set at an apartment, he said he was thinking of Rear Window, because when he watches Rear Window, as he said, you just want to be in that room with those people watching things happen. So thank you. Yes, I believe a question in the back.
Thank you.
And a microphone is on your way. It's on its way. Thank you, TJ.
This is my chance. A lot of it was really implausible, that they were sitting right on the edge of the window and nobody noticing them looking at them. All the vegetation was as fake as it could possibly be. That he was 1 week away from being out of his cast, but basically an invalid. What is that intentional, or just do we give him a bye because we're looking at other stuff?
Well, I say this not in any way being intending to be sardonic, but I would say if you're looking for logic, avoid movies made by Alfred Hitchcock and stories by Cornell Woolrich. Cornell Woolrich, who provided the source material, boy, compared to him, Hitchcock looks like a documentarian because. And I love Cornell Woolrich, but his books and short stories, which inspired many, many great movies, The Window, The Bride Wore Black, Phantom Lady, many, many others, they are all based on a nightmarish feel of emotion, as if it's happening in a dream. And that is, I think, to answer your question, yes, you're supposed to give it a pass. You're supposed to be involved sufficiently in the emotions and the characters to allow a certain movie dream logic, movie logic, call it what you will, or not. I mean, it certainly is valid. I know people who, if a film is too implausible, it just doesn't work for them. And I have that problem on certain movies, and I don't on others, and it's irrational. And I think that's the place Mr. Hitchcock liked to go, was the irrational. When he made North by Northwest 5 years later, he told an interviewer that he would have been perfectly happy taking all the various great set pieces in that film, Mount Rushmore, the crop duster firing bullets at Cary Grant, etc., and just plopped Cary Grant from one to the other as if in a nightmare, going from place to place. But of course he had to make a film, and he commissioned, as he did on this, a brilliant screenwriter, in that case Ernest Lehman, to give us great dialogue, vivid characters played by impossibly gorgeous and handsome people to provide more than just connective tissue. But Hitchcock did often start from a premise, an emotion, a scene he saw in his mind, which is what much of North by Northwest was. So you're absolutely right, and it's certainly anyone's right to not buy in because of those things if one feels that way. Thank you. Yes, another question coming.
Hi, was it colorized?
No, it was shot in Technicolor. And the following year, Robert Burks shot in Technicolor To Catch a Thief, which won him his Oscar, and shot in VistaVision format. Yes, hang on just 1 second, sir, or if you want to just call it out, I'll hear you. Well, Miss Lonely Hearts, as Jeffries calls her, decides not to take the pills when she hears the music, and that's why she's over with the songwriter at the end. I know there's a lot going on because that's when Lisa is breaking in, so yes, exactly, easy to miss. Yes, Mr. Wayne Bryan in the background.
Wasn't there something about having to excavate in the studio to get it up to 5 stories? I seem to remember something about that.
Your memory is good, and this is my brother, the one and only actor, producer, director Wayne Bryan, and I think he's probably the reason I'm here, because I used to ask him, what was it like, watching movies in the mid to late 1950s when he was a child? And he said it was great because every year you got a new Hitchcock movie. And he's right, in 58, Vertigo, 59, North by Northwest, Psycho in 1960. I mean, he was on a roll, and that was a good time to go to the movies. But to answer Wayne's question, he was saying, wasn't there some digging that had to be done for the set? Yes, the apartment across the way was at the ground level of the studio, so they had to excavate down to create the courtyard and that area that they are in that is beneath. So, although there are not a lot of, even though you stay in an apartment, a lot of money was put into building those sets, but in those days you still had staff, technicians, so it was far less expensive than it would today, say, to create a set on that scale. And watching the scene with the rain reminded me that to ensure that the rest of the set did not get wet, they installed a system so that the rain was falling right outside the window of Jimmy Stewart's apartment into, what am I trying to say, a trough, a receptacle there, so nothing else would get wet. And they did that in the isolated places where you needed to see the rain because they didn't want to have to stop shooting. Thank you, Wayne. Yes, in the back, a microphone coming soon.
Did they paint the building brick and the mortar?
I'm sorry?
Did they paint the building the brick? Did they paint the brick and the mortar?
Did they
mortar?
pay for the brick and mortar?
Yeah, or was that because
Paint.
It looked very clean.
Yes, anything you see was painted by set people, yes. Yes, ma'am, in the middle.
Did Grace Kelly do all the climbing herself?
I was thinking the same thing myself. I've never read anything pro or con as to whether Grace Kelly is doing the climbing, but I would say she didn't for the simple reason that if anyone, even if you twisted your ankle or and we all know you can step the wrong way and something can happen, that kind of climbing into the window, they would not have a star do. And I would bet that Hitchcock almost would insist that she not do it. So my guess is that they had what I think was a good body double for that moment of her climbing in, because for all the actors who say they do their own stunts, well, now you really don't have to because of CG, but when they did, it was rare that studios would allow stars to, simply because to stop down on a production like this would be quite costly. And Hitchcock, as the person who would make all the money 8 years after this film was released, I'm sure wanted to keep the costs down. And I do think his Paramount films are beautifully made. To me, they're the most handsome-looking films that he did. The ones that follow, especially like Vertigo and To Catch a Thief. But thank you for asking. Any other questions? Yes.
What were the later years of his life like? Alfred Hitchcock's life?
Hitchcock's later years, so as we don't end on too down a note, I will say not as good as his years of the 50s and 60s. Tastes were changing. He found it harder to find material that he connected with, or if he liked it, the studio didn't like it. So really the golden age of Hitchcock is considered, generally speaking, and we can all choose our favorites, from Rear Window to Psycho of 1954 to 60. Some people would include The Birds in that. By Marnie, it's getting iffy. And after that, you're on your own, I think. Those later movies have good scenes in them. But then again, he made about 55 films. So I think he has a higher track record than any other director before or since. And Jack, I'll be happy to fill you in on a longer version of that later. Thank you for asking. Well, yes, sir. Was it purposeful that he was in a wheelchair for the entire movie? Yes, that was the gimmick of I would say the device of the story. And the great crime writer Raymond Chandler, who didn't have tons of great things to say about other writers, did admire Woolrich, and he called him the idea guy or the best idea man. I forget the exact phrase. And it's true that in hundreds of stories, Woolrich could come up with a concept and sometimes write 5 different successful stories, all starting with the same premise of a wallet gets dropped and a guy picks it up. Well, that's like a novel and 5 short stories for him. And so for Woolrich, the idea was the entrapment. And Woolrich himself was something of a shut-in. He lived with his mother all of his life. I think he snuck out at night and observed the seedy, sordid side of New York to write about it so well, but he didn't see other people. He was a self-imposed shut-in for virtually his entire life. So one day he came up with this idea of a writer who was, or a character rather, who was in a wheelchair, couldn't get out, and of course that creates the suspense that Hitchcock intensified of the inability for Stewart to get out, because if he could walk, you'd just get out of that apartment and do a lot more. And I think I'm sure actually that the notion of keeping it in that location was part of the appeal to Hitchcock, of creating a world that he could totally control. So yes, thank you. Follow up? Yeah, or yes, question?
Yeah, chronologically, when did Hitchcock begin his TV?
When did Hitchcock begin his TV years? Right after this, because the smart agent, Lew Wasserman, who made him this incredible deal that made him tens of millions, said, and we want you to host your own television series. And Hitchcock said something to the effect of, absolutely not, I don't even watch television. And then Lew Wasserman said, you'd only have to host it, we'll hire good people, you'll hire people you trust to pick the stories, to direct, you'll supervise a little, and we'll shoot all of your intros and outros in a few days, and you'll own every episode. And Hitchcock said a more erudite variation on sold. When do we start? And that series made him many, many more fortunes. So he was, to his last day, very, very well off. In fact, so much so that when his agent, Lou Wasserman, in effect bought Universal Studios, his company, MCA, took over Universal in later years, Hitchcock was their third highest shareholder. He was very happy the last year. I'll say one thing about his late years. He was very happy the year before his last film when Jaws came out, released by Universal. He did very, very well as a shareholder. And I think on that positive note, I will just say, please come back next Monday. I know it's the holidays and we're all getting busy, but you will have an absolutely delightful time watching the Frank Capra romantic comedy, It Happened One Night, another movie that plays great with an audience. Thank you, TJ, Aaron, Stephen, and the team here. Thanks all of you for being here. This has been great fun sharing a bit of Greenwich Village Hitchcock style with you, and I hope I'll see you next Monday. Thanks so much.